Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Quiet History. Tonight, we drift westward into a world that appeared almost overnight, then faded just as quickly into legend. A place where distance stretched endlessly in every direction, where opportunity called from just beyond the horizon, and where a single season could change a life completely. The Wild West was not simply a setting on a map. It was a force, pulling people across deserts, mountains, and open plains, each step filled with risk, uncertainty, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Here, law struggled to keep pace with ambition. Towns rose from dust and returned to it. Fortunes were found, then lost, then found again. Cultures met, clashed, and reshaped each other in ways that still echo quietly today. Before we begin, wherever you are right now, let the day go. Let your shoulders fall. Let your breathing slow down to something gentler than it's been all day. There is nothing urgent where we are going, only a long, unhurried ride through one of the strangest and most human chapters in history. Let's begin. A world built on speed. The most remarkable thing about the Wild West was not its violence, or its vastness, or even its strange cast of characters. It was the speed. A camp of tents could become a proper town within weeks. A town of rough wooden buildings could grow into a city with hotels, banks, and theaters in just a few years. Then that same place might collapse just as quickly. When the silver ran out, when cattle prices dropped, or when a railroad company chose a different route and simply moved on without a second thought. People often arrived before streets were finished, before laws were settled, before anyone knew whether the place would last the winter or disappear before spring. That speed gave the era its particular electric feeling. Everything was unfinished, unstable, and full of possibility. A landscape that looked completely empty in spring could hold a bustling settlement by autumn, and that same settlement might be reduced to a handful of abandoned buildings by the following year. This was not the slow unfolding of older civilizations. This was something faster and stranger, a rush of ambition and reinvention that could appear and disappear almost in the same breath. At the heart of this acceleration was a simple and nearly irresistible rumor. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ordinary Earth might contain enough wealth to change a life forever. That single idea was enough to uproot farmers, clerks, sailors, and craftsmen by the thousands. Enough to send people across the entire continent by wagon, around Cape Horn by ship, through fever-ridden jungles in Panama, just to reach a coast where they could sail north and try their luck in the gold fields. Many never found riches. Some never arrived at all, lost to disease, accidents, weather, or the sheer punishing distance of the journey. Yet the possibility alone had a strange gravitational pull. Gold made danger feel negotiable. It made distance feel smaller than it actually was. It made people willing to gamble everything, their savings, their homes, their families, their lives, on a glitter in river gravel. And it was not only gold, silver, land, cattle, trade. The West offered many versions of the same basic promise. Come here, risk everything. Maybe the world changes. That promise was powerful enough to set entire populations in motion, and the effects were visible almost immediately. California is the clearest example of what that kind of rush could do to a landscape. Before the gold discovery in the late 1840s, it was a quiet region of ranches, missions, and small coastal settlements. Within 2 years, it had become one of the most talked about places on Earth. Ships crowded its harbor, prices soared overnight. Entire towns appeared where there had been nothing before. The scale of transformation was so sudden and so complete that people living through it must have felt they were watching reality itself being rewritten in real time. Then there was the railroad, which accelerated everything even further. One line of steel could transform empty prairie into a roaring town almost overnight. Before the tracks arrived, a settlement might be nothing more than grassland, wind, and a few scattered cabins belonging to people who had drifted there for reasons of their own. Once a railroad company chose a stop, once that decision was made in some distant office by men who had never seen the land, everything changed within months. Laborers came first, drawn by wages and the promise of steady work. Then merchants arrived, understanding that where laborers gathered, customers would follow. Then surveyors, saloon keepers, speculators, and families came close behind. Grain could be shipped out to distant markets. Lumber and machinery could be brought in. News, money, mail, and strangers began moving at a speed that older frontier life had never known and could barely accommodate. Businesses appeared because trains created customers. Hotels filled because travelers now had somewhere to stop. Land prices leapt because access meant profit. And profit meant everything in a world built on speculation. Rival towns sometimes fought desperately to win a depot stop, because missing the railroad line was not simply an inconvenience. It could mean slow death, a gradual draining of population, commerce, and relevance until nothing remained but a quiet place where something almost happened. In the West, geography still mattered enormously, but railroads suddenly mattered more. One decision made in a company office far away could create a thriving place from almost nothing, or leave another settlement to wither quietly in the dust, watching the horizon for trains that would never come. But beneath all this speed and ambition lay a truth that the legend has always struggled to hold clearly in view. The West was never empty. Before wagon trains and rail lines pushed westward, the land already held nations. It held trade routes stretching hundreds of miles. It held sacred places, political alliances, hunting grounds, farms, and cities of memory that went back far beyond anything newcomers could imagine. The continent was not waiting to be discovered. It was already inhabited, understood, and deeply lived in by peoples who had shaped their lives around these landscapes for generations. The Lakota, Comanche, Apache, Cheyenne, Nez Perce, Navajo, and countless others knew these lands with a depth that newly arrived settlers could barely begin to appreciate. They knew where water lay hidden in dry country where no obvious source was visible. They knew when the herds moved and how the weather shifted across the plains before any instrument could measure it. They knew which routes meant survival and which ones, chosen at the wrong season, could mean disaster. Westward expansion did not enter a blank space. It entered occupied worlds. And that changes the emotional center of everything that follows. It turns the story from a simple tale of adventure and progress into something more complicated. A story of collision, pressure, resistance, and loss, running alongside every act of building and settlement. The more clearly that is understood, the more real the era becomes, and the less it resembles the comfortable old myth. The real shape of cowboy life. Hollywood gave us a particular image, and it was a powerful one. A lone rider against a wide sky. A gunfighter with steady nerves and a talent for the dramatic moment. A figure defined by endless showdowns and a kind of lonely heroism that seemed to belong to no particular time or place. The image became so familiar that it started to feel like memory rather than invention. The working reality was tougher, dustier, and far less glamorous than any of that. Most cowboys were hired laborers. They mended gear, watched herds through long, uneventful nights, rode through bad weather without complaint because complaining changed nothing, and spent their days repeating exhausting tasks that demanded patience and physical endurance far more than they demanded swagger or theatrical courage. They earned modest wages for long hours in conditions that could turn genuinely dangerous without much warning. A frightened herd, a swollen river after rain, a sudden storm rolling in from the north. Any of these could become deadly for someone who was not paying close attention at exactly the right moment. The work required real skill, but it was skill built through repetition and hard experience rather than through any kind of dramatic talent. A good cowhand knew how cattle moved, how they thought in large numbers, how fear could spread through a herd like fire through dry grass. He knew how to read weather from the color of the sky and the direction of the wind. He knew how to manage his horse across difficult ground, how to judge a river crossing, and how to stay calm in situations where calm was the only tool that actually helped. Many cowboys were very young. Some were barely teenagers, expected to take on significant responsibility in a world that had very little patience for inexperience. They were asked to help control herds worth small fortunes while earning wages that would seem almost insulting in comparison to the value they were protecting. Youth and low pay were simply part of the arrangement, accepted because the alternative was no work at all. And many were Black, Mexican, or indigenous, a fact that later popular culture pushed quietly aside until whole groups nearly vanished from the story that was told to later generations. Black cowboys found real employment in ranch labor after emancipation, working within a society still deeply shaped by racism and operating under conditions that made their daily lives considerably more difficult than those of white co-workers. Yet they were there, skilled and essential, doing the same punishing work for often lower wages and with far less chance of recognition. Some became genuinely accomplished horsemen and trail hands, whose reputations were known and respected within the cattle world, even as that same world denied them the broader standing they deserved. Mexican riders brought knowledge, vocabulary, and working traditions rooted in generations of horsemanship that predated the American cattle industry entirely. They were not simply workers absorbed into someone else's system. In many important ways, they helped create the system that later became famous under other names. Their techniques, their equipment, their ways of reading cattle and land, all of it traveled northward across shifting borders and became central to what the world would later call cowboy culture. Indigenous men also worked in ranching, drawing on their own deep experience with animals, land, and movement across open country. Their presence is even more thoroughly erased from popular memory, which is a particular kind of injustice, given how completely the West was shaped by their knowledge of the landscapes that everyone else was still learning. The myth whitened this world. The truth was diverse from the very beginning. Even the famous image of the mounted cattle worker owes far more to older traditions than most people realize. The vaquero tradition had already developed across Spanish and Mexican lands long before the classic American cowboy entered any legend. Skilled horsemen had refined methods of herding, roping, and cattle handling that would later become central to ranch work across the entire western half of the continent. The lasso came from that tradition. The chaps came from that tradition. The working techniques later celebrated in rodeo came from that tradition. Cowboy culture was not invented from empty space. It was inherited, adapted, and then, in the retelling, quietly stripped of its older roots until it seemed to have appeared from nowhere. What the cattle drives actually required, beyond individual skill, was sustained collective management of an almost impossibly complex logistical challenge. A trail boss had to read weather before it arrived, judge routes through country he might be crossing for the first time, negotiate river crossings that could kill men and scatter cattle in minutes, manage supplies that had to last for weeks across territory where resupply was not always possible, and make decisions quickly and correctly when trouble broke loose. Because trouble on a cattle drive did not wait politely for careful deliberation. He was responsible not only for the herd, but for the crew holding it together through fear, fatigue, boredom, physical pain, and the slow, grinding pressure of weeks on the trail, far from anything familiar. A man who misjudged the land or mishandled his crew could destroy the entire venture. Fortunes could be lost not in a robbery or a storm, but simply through poor leadership applied at the wrong moment. A stampede at night could destroy months of careful work in under 2 minutes. Imagine a herd already uneasy in darkness. Hundreds or thousands of animals, half sleeping, always alert to movement, thunder, strange scent, or sudden noise. Then something startles them. A crack of lightning, a panicked animal at the edge of the herd, a rider's mistake, a sound that carries wrong on the night wind, and the fear ripples outward faster than thought. Once the herd breaks, it becomes an avalanche of muscle and momentum. Men are thrown from horses. Cattle scatter across miles of dark country. Valuable animals vanish into ravines or drown in unseen water. The order that took weeks to maintain collapses in seconds, and rebuilding it costs time, energy, and sometimes lives. River crossings were equally dangerous in their own way, not through sudden chaos, but through the combination of water, weight, and the unpredictable behavior of frightened animals in a current they couldn't read. A crossing needed judgment before it needed bravery. Riders had to choose where the bottom was firm enough, where the current was manageable, and where the banks on both sides would allow the herd to enter and exit without bunching into a panicked mass. Even when all of that was judged correctly, things could still go wrong with terrible speed. Cattle lost footing. Men were swept from horses. Wagons sank in unexpected mud. A successful crossing felt like a genuine achievement. A bad one could wreck the herd, the crew, and the profits of the entire journey in one terrible afternoon. The chuck wagon, that rolling kitchen at the center of every cattle drive, was often more important to a drive's ultimate success than any individual rider's skill with a rope or a gun. The cook had unusual authority in the daily life of the trail. He set the rhythm of meals, guarded provisions against waste and theft, and influenced the mood of the crew as surely as the trail boss influenced its direction. Hot coffee and edible food at the end of a hard day meant that life still had some structure, some small comfort to anchor the exhaustion. A poor cook could sour the mood of an entire crew within days, in ways that were difficult to correct without stopping the whole operation. Western history tends to spotlight gunmen and trail bosses, and the occasional dramatic rescue. But that rolling kitchen quietly sustained the entire enterprise, one meal at a time, for weeks on end across country that offered very little in the way of comfort or assistance. Towns, saloons, and the architecture of uncertainty. Some frontier towns had more saloons than homes or churches combined. That sounds like deliberate exaggeration until you understand how these places actually grew, not according to any plan, but according to the logic of fast money and immediate need. A settlement would fill first with single men chasing wages, or cards, or simply the excitement of being somewhere new and unregulated. In that environment, drink, gambling, and quick entertainment became some of the fastest businesses anyone could establish. A saloon needed far less patience than a schoolhouse and far less optimism than a church. It could be thrown together quickly from whatever lumber was available, stocked with whiskey transported at considerable expense from distant suppliers, and open to paying customers by nightfall of the same day it was framed. But these rooms were never only about whiskey, and reducing them to simple drinking establishments misses most of what made them important. Saloons served as meeting places where men gathered to exchange information in a world where information traveled slowly and unreliably. They served as hiring halls where ranchers found labor and workers found employers. They functioned as mail drops, rumor exchanges, and political stages where the arguments that shaped local government were made and unmade over card tables. Deals were struck at those tables, real business deals involving cattle, land, supplies, and labor, because the saloon was where people gathered, and gathering was where commerce happened. Elections were argued there, grudges formed there. Fortunes changed hands there over cards and dice and wagers on almost anything imaginable. The sheer number of saloons in a given town told you something important about what kind of place it was, not yet built for permanence or family life, not yet organized around the slower rhythms of settlement and community, but balanced on appetite, cash, and a kind of breathless uncertainty that could turn exciting or dangerous depending on the night. The streets outside those saloons could be spectacular in the wrong ways. After rain, frontier streets became deep-sucking trenches where boots stuck with every step, wagon wheels sank to their axles, and the surface combined mud with animal waste, discarded refuse, and the accumulated debris of a settlement that had appeared too fast for anyone to think carefully about drainage or sanitation. Crossing from one side of the street to the other could become a genuine ordeal, particularly for anyone who had made any effort at all toward presentable clothing. Then the fierce western sun could dry it all out within hours, turning the same street into a choking cloud of dust that coated food left uncovered in shop doorways, worked its way into clothing and lungs, and settled over everything with a persistence that made cleanliness feel like a philosophical position rather than an achievable condition. Wooden sidewalks were the practical answer that most towns arrived at fairly quickly. Raised platforms of planking that lifted pedestrians above the worst of the street-level chaos and gave at least some structure to public movement through a settlement that was otherwise making up its own rules as it went along. They created their own distinctive soundscape too. Boots thudded on dry boards, heels clicked, and loose planks rattled and shifted as people moved from shop to shop in the particular rhythm that became associated with Western town life. The sounds of wooden sidewalks and the sounds of spurs became part of the same acoustic landscape. These sidewalks were not perfect. They splintered, shifted, and sometimes concealed unpleasant surprises beneath their boards. But they made commerce possible in places where the ground itself actively resisted cooperation. Settlements did not wait for ideal conditions before insisting they were proper towns. They built a narrow platform of order above the muck and carried on with business anyway, which captures something essential about the Western spirit, not patience, but insistence. Fire was a constant and terrifying threat in these environments, and it reshaped settlements repeatedly throughout the era. Buildings went up fast, often with dry timber harvested from whatever source was nearest. Thin walls that provided minimum insulation and maximum fuel. Wood stoves that worked hard through cold nights and cold mornings. And oil lamps that provided light at the cost of keeping an open flame in close proximity to all that dry wood. Wind, which blew reliably and sometimes viciously across open western country, could turn a small fire in one building into a racing disaster that consumed an entire block in the time it took someone to run for water. Water supplies in younger towns were limited, often depending on barrels or hand-pumped wells rather than anything like organized infrastructure. Fire services barely existed. One overturned lamp, one chimney problem, one spark landing wrong on a dry roof, and a business district that had taken years to assemble could be reduced to charred foundations and bitter smoke within hours. Rebuilding became a strange and specific frontier skill. People salvaged what could be saved from the wreckage, cleared ash and debris with whatever tools were available, raised new walls using lumber hauled from wherever it could be found at short notice, and resumed trade with remarkable speed. because there was simply no other viable choice. Capital and confidence depended on refusing to let fire become the final word. The town that stopped rebuilding was the town that died, and everyone understood that. These repeated destructions reveal something important about how precarious Western growth really was in those early years. Prosperity did not rest on sturdy foundations. At first, it rested on determination, urgency, and luck in roughly equal measure. A settlement could look solid and permanent from a distance, while still being, at its core, one bad night away from charred emptiness and a fresh start. Yet alongside the mud and the fire risk and the constant improvisation, there were always signs of something else. Signs of communities reaching toward permanence and respectability with genuine urgency. Hotels, banks, and opera houses followed wealth into unlikely places. Once money began flowing from mines or cattle or land speculation, people wanted more than rough shelter and supply stores. They wanted signals, visible architectural signals, that their town was real and intended to last. A hotel that welcomed investors and officials and respectable travelers suggested importance. A bank promised stability and the possibility that local fortune could be organized and grown rather than simply spent or lost. An opera house in the middle of the desert, surrounded by scrub and dry wind, and the raw smell of a young settlement, was a declaration of ambition so bold it bordered on defiance. It announced that this place expected refinement along with profit, that it intended to become something more than a camp that happened to have streets. Some frontier newspapers were printed before streets were even properly named. Editors boosted their settlements, attacked political enemies, praised investors who might bring capital, and shaped the public identity of places that were still deciding what they were and whether they would survive. Language and ambition arrived before infrastructure. The frontier town could become real not through careful planning, but through bold headlines insisting that significance had already arrived, and daring anyone to disagree. Law, order, and the space between them. A sheriff could be feared, admired, corrupt, or all three simultaneously. On the frontier, a badge did not create a fixed kind of man. It revealed what sort of man already stood beneath it, and the range of men who stood beneath those badges was extraordinarily wide. Some sheriffs were steady figures who kept order in places that badly needed it. Men who understood that their job was not personal glory, but the maintenance of conditions in which ordinary people could live and work without constant fear. They pursued criminals with persistence, managed jails with whatever resources were available, collected taxes that nobody wanted to pay, and served legal papers on people who would rather not have received them. Doing all of this with a consistency that gradually built something like trust in communities that had started with very little of it. Others drank too much, played obvious favorites, collected fees aggressively from anyone who couldn't push back, or used the office as a straightforward tool for personal enrichment and local political power. In many counties, the position was elected, which meant that popularity could matter as much as principle, and that a man who understood how to work a crowd might win a badge over someone more qualified but less charming. A sheriff might be respected by merchants while being despised by ranch hands, might pursue certain categories of crime with genuine energy while looking the other way at others, depending on money, family connections, or the shifting calculations of local politics. The role demanded an unusual combination of qualities: enough courage to confront dangerous people, enough administrative capability to manage a jail and collect taxes and serve legal papers, enough political skill to maintain alliances in a world where power shifted constantly, and enough personal authority to command respect from people who had little natural inclination toward deference. Men who possessed all of these qualities simultaneously were rare. Men who were hired for the job regardless were considerably more common. The line between lawman and outlaw was not always as clear as legend prefers to imagine. And this is one of the details that makes the actual history so much more interesting than the simplified version. The frontier was a small world in certain strange ways. Men moved from town to town, drifted between jobs, served in local militias, rode cattle trails across hundreds of miles, gambled in the same establishments, and crossed paths with the same people again and again over years of wandering through the same general territory. Because of that constant circulation, the person currently wearing a badge and the person currently being pursued had often occupied, at different moments, the same social spaces, the same employer relationships, the same networks of obligation and debt and friendship. A sheriff might have shared a card table with the man he was now obligated to arrest. A deputy might once have ridden with a future bandit before circumstances pushed them in different directions. Old alliances, old resentments, old private knowledge about how a particular man behaved under pressure. All of this followed people across the West and gave many confrontations an intimacy that later legend tends to flatten into something simpler and cleaner than it actually was. These were not always confrontations between strangers representing opposite principles. They could be reckonings between people who understood each other's habits and histories with uncomfortable depth. And that personal knowledge could make everything simultaneously more human and more dangerous. Vigilantes appeared where courts were weak, distant, or simply mistrusted. And their history is one of the most morally complicated parts of this entire era. When formal justice seemed too slow, too corrupt, too expensive, or too likely to deliver unsatisfying results, some residents took punishment into their own hands. A vigilance committee would present itself as a necessary response, claiming to defend honest citizens when the institutions meant to protect them had failed visibly and repeatedly. Sometimes these groups did emerge from genuine frustration with real failures of the official system. The grievances that gave rise to them were often legitimate, even when the responses were not. But the danger was built into the idea from the very beginning, and it was a danger that emerged with depressing regularity whenever these groups formed. Once private citizens claimed the right to arrest, judge, and punish outside normal legal process, justice became something harsher and far less reliable. Personal grudges found room to operate dressed up as civic duty. Panic and prejudice shaped decisions that could not be appealed or corrected. Rumor became evidence. Accusation became conviction with frightening speed. A community's genuine hunger for order could produce irreversible decisions long before anyone had carefully asked whether the right person was paying the price. Frontier justice could be swift, public, and deeply wrong all at the same time, and the speed and publicity often made the wrongness worse rather than better, because it removed the possibility of correction. Jails were sometimes so flimsy that prisoners simply cut through the walls and walked away. A lockup in a newer or poorer settlement might be little more than a small wooden structure with barred openings and walls that a determined person with time and a hidden implement could defeat without enormous difficulty. Escape stories were not rare flourishes of legend. They were built into the practical limitations of frontier construction and frontier budgets. Security depended on materials, manpower, and money that were all chronically in short supply. The image of the solid stone cell with iron doors belongs to a later and stronger state. On the frontier, confinement itself was sometimes still under construction, and the gap between declaring someone imprisoned and actually keeping them there could be embarrassingly wide. Guns were more controlled in frontier towns than popular imagination allows. Many Western communities actually tried to regulate the public carrying of weapons, particularly in the busy commercial districts where the combination of alcohol, gambling, crowding, and financial stress could turn ordinary human tensions into something fatal, with very little additional encouragement. Visitors arriving in town were sometimes expected to surrender firearms at the edge of settlement or keep them secured during their stay. The goal was not to eliminate violence entirely, which would have been both unrealistic and probably unenforceable. It was to reduce the odds of drunken arguments becoming funerals. Many residents of frontier towns did not celebrate chaos and did not want to live in it. They wanted trade, stability, and streets where business could continue without constant fear. They wanted to build something that would last. The image of universal armed freedom moving through Western streets is powerful and persistent. The historical picture is more interesting. Town leaders who understood that a settlement could not become prosperous or respectable if every quarrel had a loaded weapon sitting one heartbeat away from use. Famous towns and what made them. Dodge City became legendary long before most Americans had ever actually seen it. And that gap between reputation and reality is itself one of the most interesting things about the place. Its fame traveled through newspapers, railroad talk, traveling performers, and the pages of popular fiction, until it had become a symbol in the national imagination before countless readers had any real sense of what the town actually looked like, smelled like, or felt like to live in. The legend moved faster than information. People knew the name and knew what it was supposed to mean. Danger, speed, Western energy, vice concentrated into a few square blocks of unpaved streets. Long before they knew any particular fact about the place that name described. What actually made Dodge City significant was its position at a crucial junction in the cattle trade. Herds coming north from Texas met the machinery of shipment and sale there. The stockyards, the buyers, the railroad cars waiting to carry beef to eastern markets. That practical function brought money, noise, transience, and conflict in roughly equal measure. Young drovers arrived after brutal months on the trail with wages in their pockets and very little impulse toward restraint. Merchants saw opportunity and moved quickly. So did gamblers, dance hall operators,
and the law officers who were paid to contain the consequences of putting all of those people together in one place with plentiful alcohol and limited oversight. Over time, the city became larger in the American imagination than it ever was in geography. It stood for vice and speed and frontier energy, and that symbolic role began forming while cattle were still crowding its streets and the mud was still fresh. People were already consuming the frontier as a story, even while it was still unfolding.
The West was becoming a national performance before it had finished being a daily reality, and Dodge City was one of the clearest examples of that strange doubling. Tombstone rose from something harsher, under conditions that made its very existence feel like an act of collective stubbornness. This was not a hospitable valley waiting to be settled by people who simply needed the courage to arrive. It was desert country, where water was genuinely scarce, heat could be punishing for months at a stretch, and survival itself required careful planning rather than optimism. The location offered nothing welcoming, except what lay underground. Then silver was discovered, and wealth changed what people were willing to endure. Investors poured in from distant cities. Miners arrived, carrying tools and ambitions shaped by rumors that may or may not have matched the reality waiting for them. Businesses followed. Saloons and restaurants and supply stores and all the other establishments that appear wherever people with wages gather and need things. Buildings climbed out of the dust because underground riches made the discomfort of the surface seem worth tolerating. The tension that gave Tombstone its particular edge was built into its physical situation. Everyday life was shaped by scarcity above ground and expectation below it. Fortunes depended entirely on what could be hauled from deep shafts in a landscape that offered almost nothing freely on its surface. That combination, harsh environment, sudden wealth, rapid growth, and the constant pressure of working in difficult conditions for stakes that could change overnight, created the volatile atmosphere that made Tombstone famous and kept it famous long after the silver was gone. Deadwood grew so quickly that rules barely kept pace with the growth, and the rules that did exist arrived late enough to feel almost decorative against the reality of what the town had already become. The settlement story begins with a tension that never fully resolved. People flooded into the Black Hills chasing gold, even though the area lay within land that treaty agreements had recognized as belonging to the Lakota people. That fact gave the settlement a charged beginning. Not merely rough in the way frontier towns were routinely rough, but morally compromised at its foundation in a way that shaped everything that followed. The claims being staked were themselves claims against prior claims. The wealth being pursued was being pursued on ground that was not legally available for that pursuit. Then, growth came so fast that institutions lagged behind almost everything. Disputes erupted before anyone had established clear processes for resolving them. Businesses opened in spaces that had been vacant the week before. Crowds thickened before anyone had thought carefully about water supply, waste disposal, or the basic infrastructure that turns a gathering of people into something sustainable. In that atmosphere of improvisation and speed, reputations formed quickly because there was no time for slower processes. And danger could become a form of entertainment precisely because the stakes were already so high and the rules so thin. San Francisco occupied a different category entirely. Not a mining camp or a cattle town, but a genuine port city that expanded into something with global significance almost overnight. Before the gold rush, it was a modest settlement with a useful harbor, and not much else to recommend it beyond location. After gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada foothills, it became one of the great gateways of the Pacific world almost immediately. Ships arrived from distances that would have seemed implausible only years before. From Latin America, from China, from Australia, from Europe, from the eastern United States. Goods of every description flowed through its docks and warehouses. Some ships' crews deserted as soon as they landed because the sailors who had brought paying passengers across oceans also wanted their chance at gold. And the harbor gradually filled with abandoned vessels as a result. The city's importance was never only regional, which is what makes its rise so revealing about the nature of Western expansion. The Wild West was not a closed system developing in isolation from the rest of the world. It was plugged into oceans and trade networks and migration streams that connected it to almost every corner of the inhabited earth. San Francisco made that visible in a way no other Western city quite matched. And then there were the ghost towns, which tell perhaps the most honest story of all about what Western hope actually cost. A mining settlement could be loud, with hammers and arguments and music and the constant noise of ambition for a few intense years. Genuinely alive in every sense, full of people who had traveled extraordinary distances to be there, and who were investing everything they had in its future. Then the ore would thin, prices would drop, investors would move on, and the place would begin to empty. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed as people recognized that staying was no longer rational. Buildings sagged as the timber dried and walked without maintenance. Roofs failed, glass shattered and was not replaced. Graves remained because the dead could not leave when the living did. What stayed behind were fragments that whisper of vanished life with unusual force. Rusted cans, broken crockery, medicine bottles, collapsed mine shafts, cemetery markers with names and dates, and sometimes a few words that someone thought important enough to carve into stone for a person who would never return. People once imagined futures there. The markers are what imagination left behind when the economics changed. Gold, silver, and the economics of dreams. Very few events in the history of the American West changed a region as fast or as completely as the California gold rush, and very few events anywhere reveal human hope so vividly and so mercilessly at the same time. Once news spread that gold had been found at Sutter's Mill in the Sierra Nevada foothills in early 1848, migration surged with a force that seems almost impossible to explain through rational calculation. People did not move toward California after careful analysis of their probable chances. They moved because the possibility of transformation, sudden, complete, life-altering transformation, was more powerful than the probability of failure, even when failure was clearly the more likely outcome. Something in the human mind responds to that kind of possibility with a force that ordinary prudence cannot easily contain. They came by wagon across the continent, facing months of exhausting travel through terrain that could kill horses and people with equal indifference. They came by ship around Cape Horn, which meant a voyage of many months through some of the roughest seas on Earth. They came by way of Panama, crossing the isthmus through jungle and fever and genuine physical danger to catch another vessel on the Pacific side and sail north toward the gold fields. Every route was difficult. Every route killed some of the people who attempted it. None of that stopped the movement from accelerating year after year through the early 1850s. California's population swelled with a speed that strained every system that existed for managing the consequences of sudden mass arrival. Indigenous communities faced invasion and devastating violence as newcomers spread across traditional lands with no particular interest in the people already living there. Trade expanded overnight as the demand for every conceivable good created instant markets. Ports grew crowded with ships from around the world. Prices soared because supply could not keep pace with the sudden appearance of so many people with money and urgent needs. What makes the rush so gripping, beyond the spectacle of it, is what it reveals about the gap between expectation and reality, and about who actually profited from the movement of so many people toward a single destination. Gold seekers often found disappointment faster than fortune, and they found it in ways that were particularly deflating, because the disappointment arrived not through dramatic failure, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary misery. Many arrived imagining nuggets lying close to the surface, in quantities generous enough to reward any person willing to bend down and pick them up. That image had been encouraged by early reports that were, to put it charitably, selected for their most optimistic elements. By the time large numbers of miners reached the gold fields, the easiest surface deposits were often already gone, claimed by people who had arrived earlier and worked them quickly. What remained required real labor, cold water, cramped positions, repetitive work, and the constant management of equipment that broke at inconvenient moments. A miner might work for weeks with little to show for it, beyond sore hands, wet clothes, mounting frustration, and a debt to supply merchants that grew faster than any gold he found. The gap between the dream and the daily reality of kneeling in a cold stream could be genuinely shocking for people who had traveled thousands of miles, based on stories that emphasized the success stories and quietly omitted the far more numerous failures. Meanwhile, storekeepers, transport operators, boarding house owners, and tool sellers often earned steadier and more reliable profits from the rush than the prospectors themselves. That reversal is one of the most revealing economic truths in all of Western history. The men and women in the streams and diggings were the visible symbols of the age, the people the newspapers wrote about, the people the stories followed, the people the paintings showed bent over long toms and rocker boxes under dramatic Western skies. Yet the people who most reliably prospered often stood behind counters rather than in water. Merchants sold pans and pigs and boots and flour and candles and whiskey at prices swollen by distance and demand. And every miner needed all of those things, regardless of how his claims were performing. A boarding house owner charged for a bed and a meal, regardless of whether the person sleeping there had found anything worth mentioning that day. Freight operators earned steady money hauling goods into remote camps where every nail and sack of beans had to be transported somehow by someone. The West promised sudden riches. It very often rewarded whoever understood hunger, scarcity, and human impatience most clearly. Nevada's silver told a similar story at a considerably larger scale and with considerably more obvious connections to national economic power. The riches pulled from the Comstock lode in Nevada were not merely local windfalls enjoyed by the people fortunate enough to be nearby when they were discovered. They fed something much larger and more consequential. Vast silver production energized banks in San Francisco and New York, attracted investors from across the country and beyond, supported transport networks and equipment suppliers across multiple states, and contributed to the financial machinery of a country that was rapidly building its industrial power during and after the Civil War. A harsh mining region in the Nevada desert, connected to distant markets by credit, speculation, and the physical movement of silver itself, could influence the direction of the United States more profoundly than its lonely landscape might ever suggest to a casual observer. Silver was not only treasure, it was fuel for transformation. And the transformation it fueled extended far beyond the desert where it was found. Hydraulic mining showed what that kind of extractive hunger could do to a landscape, with terrifying efficiency. Instead of individual miners patiently working streams and hillsides by hand, hydraulic operations used powerful jets of water to blast entire hillsides apart, turning solid earth into slurry and washing the resulting material through long sluice channels in search of gold. The method could strip a landscape that had taken geological ages to form within months of continuous operation. The scale of destruction was difficult to absorb, even for people watching it happen in real time. But the destruction did not stay confined to the immediate mine site. Mud, rock, gravel, and toxic debris surged into rivers and streams, clogged waterways that communities downstream depended on, buried farmland under feet of mining waste, and damaged ecosystems across distances that placed the source of the damage far beyond the sight or knowledge of many of the people suffering its consequences. Farmers watched fertile land they had cultivated for years, buried under waste generated by operations they had never consented to, and could do nothing to stop through ordinary means. That conflict was eventually resolved through legal action that represented one of the earliest environmental lawsuits in American history. A sign that the questions the hydraulic miners raised about the right to damage a shared landscape for private profit were not going to remain unanswered forever, even in an era that generally favored extraction over conservation. Homesteads, sod houses, and the hard mathematics of the plains. The Homestead Act of 1862 sounded almost miraculous when its provisions were described to people hungry for land and opportunity. A person could claim 160 acres of public land and, through residence and improvement over 5 years, make it legally and permanently their own. No purchase price, no auction, no competition from wealthy buyers who could simply outbid everyone else. Just the land, and the person, and the willingness to stay. The promise was genuine.
The conditions attached to it were brutal in ways that the promise did not advertise. The acreage available under the Act might look generous on a map.
On the ground, particularly across the drier regions of the Great Plains, where much of the available land was concentrated, 160 acres was often not enough to support a viable farm without access to water, without capital for equipment and seed, and the inevitable bad years. Without experience in an environment that operated by different rules than the wetter and more forgiving regions many homesteaders had come from. A homesteader arriving on their claim had to build a dwelling, begin working the land within a defined period, and remain on the claim for 5 years while demonstrating continuous improvement and occupancy. That meant 5 years during which the harvest might fail, the well might run dry, the livestock might sicken, prices for whatever crops could be grown might collapse, and the isolation might work on a family's psychology in ways that showed up slowly and then suddenly. It meant 5 years during which every setback had to be absorbed without the option of simply moving somewhere easier. Many succeeded. Their success was real and hard-won and deserves full acknowledgement. But many others failed, not through lack of effort or courage or genuine commitment to the attempt, but because the legal framework had been designed around assumptions about rainfall, soil quality, and market access that simply did not match the conditions in many of the regions where the land was actually available. On the treeless plains, where the absence of timber made conventional construction impossible or prohibitively expensive, necessity created one of the most distinctive and revealing homes in Western history. Settlers cut thick strips of tough prairie sod, the dense mat of roots and earth created by generations of grass growth, and stacked them into walls because that was simply what the environment provided. The technique sounds primitive in description. In practice, it was an intelligent and reasonably effective response to a specific set of constraints that left limited alternatives. Prairie sod was available in essentially unlimited quantities. It cost only the labor of cutting and hauling it. It could be shaped into walls that provided real insulation against both heat and cold. And in a land where summer temperatures could be genuinely extreme, and winter winds moved without obstruction across hundreds of miles of open ground, insulation was not a luxury. Yet life inside a sod house involved difficulties that modern imagination struggles to fully inhabit. Dirt sifted down from the ceiling during dry weather and turned to mud during wet. Insects found their way through every crack and gap in the walls with a persistence that required constant management. Rain could weaken the structural integrity of the walls themselves over time, requiring maintenance that added to an already demanding workload. The roof required the most attention of all, because a poorly maintained sod roof was one heavy rainstorm away from partial collapse. Light was limited because windows were expensive and the thick walls created deep frames that admitted less of it than conventional construction would have allowed. Still, families cooked, slept, argued, read, prayed, and raised children inside these earthen shelters. They made them as comfortable as resources and ingenuity allowed. They decorated the walls when they could, kept the floors as clean as the conditions permitted, and created the rhythms of family life within spaces that would strike most modern observers as barely adequate for the purpose. prairie wind was not merely weather on the Great Plains. It was a presence, persistent, wearing, and capable of entering daily life in ways that went well beyond the merely physical. It dried soil that crops needed to keep moist. It bent young plants that needed to stand upright. It rattled walls and slammed doors, and drove dust into food and bedding, and the corners of rooms where no amount of cleaning could fully defeat it. In stronger bursts, it could strip roofing loose, scatter tools that had been left in the wrong place, flatten fences that had taken days to construct, and leave a homestead looking as though something systematic and hostile had moved through it. For newcomers from more sheltered regions, from the wooded east, from European countries with different climates and more protected landscapes, the psychological weight of constant wind could be as severe as any physical challenge the plains presented. The landscape already felt vast and exposed in ways that people from smaller, more enclosed environments had never experienced. When wind took command of that vastness day after day, not for a season, but apparently without any permanent end, the exposure became deeply personal. People described feeling worn down by it, by pressure that never quite stopped, by noise that never quite allowed the silence that rest requires. Water determined which dreams survived and which settlements died more than any other single factor in Western life. A town could have energy, investment, ambition, and eager newcomers. Without a dependable water supply, it stood on a foundation that would eventually crack, regardless of how much optimism people poured into it. Ranches needed water for animals. Farms depended on it for crops. Railroads needed it for steam locomotives that consumed it in large quantities at regular intervals. Households could not endure without it for any length of time. A spring, a creek, a river, a reliable well, any of these could make one site viable, while another location only a few miles away remained untenable, regardless of how promising it looked in other respects. And the scarcity of water in many Western regions meant that its control carried power far beyond its immediate practical value. Control of water could shape property lines, determine the viability of neighboring operations, and concentrate leverage within a community in the hands of whoever happened to control the source. This is one of the most revealing truths of the West. The grand language of opportunity and independence that surrounded Western expansion often rested on something very basic. Before dreams became towns or ambitions became dynasties, somebody had to answer the practical question of where the water would come from. Without a convincing answer to that question, vision dried up as surely and as finally as everything else. Barbed wire and the closing of the open range. Barbed wire changed the West as deeply as the railroad, and it did so with a quietness and an efficiency that the railroad could never match. A railroad required capital on a scale that put it beyond the reach of any individual. It required surveys and land grants and construction crews numbering in the thousands, and the political will of distant governments. It remade landscapes through the accumulation of enormous collective effort applied over years. Barbed wire required almost none of that. A few strands of twisted metal with sharp barbs fixed to wooden posts at regular intervals. That was all it took. A single determined person with basic tools and enough wire could fence a significant piece of land in a week. Before fencing spread widely across the plains, animals moved over open range and boundaries were often loose, disputed, seasonal, or simply understood as a matter of custom rather than law. Cattle grazed where grass was available. Drovers moved herds along routes established by use rather than by legal documentation. The landscape was treated as a shared resource, whose use was regulated more by social understanding and practical necessity than by anything that could be enforced against a determined violator. Once wire began stretching across the plains, the old pattern started coming apart in ways that nobody had fully anticipated and that the law was slow to address. Ranchers enclosed pasture and water sources that had previously been accessible to neighboring operations. Farmers defended crops against cattle that had previously been able to move through. Routes that drovers had been using for years could suddenly be blocked by a fence that had appeared where open ground had been only months before. The transformation of the social landscape of the West, accomplished by barbed wire, was as significant as any achieved through violence or legislation. And it was achieved through a technology so cheap and so accessible that almost anyone with modest resources could deploy it. That accessibility was itself part of what made it so disruptive. In the old open-range system, the practical difficulty of fencing large areas had served as a kind of informal limit on how completely any individual could control access to land. Barbed wire removed that limit almost entirely. Fence cutting became a frontier crime that carried the weight of a genuine political statement. When a fence was cut, the act meant more than simple vandalism or property damage. It was a direct challenge to the new order that wire was creating, a statement that the person doing the cutting did not accept the right of the fence builder to close what had previously been open. To ranchers who had fenced their land, cutting was theft and aggression. To drovers who had lost access to routes they had been using for years. To small operators who found water sources now behind someone else's fence. Cutting was resistance against enclosure. The conflicts that emerged from this tension could escalate from individual acts of vandalism into organized campaigns and genuine range wars, because the stakes involved were not trivial inconveniences. They were questions about survival, about whether a small operation could continue functioning when the resources it depended on had been appropriated by larger and better capitalized neighbors. About whether the traditional practices that had made a certain kind of Western life possible could survive the arrival of a technology that made those practices legally and practically untenable. A fence, in the end, enforced a philosophy, a specific set of ideas about the relationship between land, ownership, and the right to exclude. When that philosophy was contested, the fence became a target because it was the most visible and most vulnerable embodiment of the ideas being disputed. The Wild West ended not with one dramatic final gunfight, but with fences, trains, and telegraphs working together to create conditions in which the old improvised world could no longer sustain itself. Popular memory loves a theatrical ending, the image of one final showdown closing the frontier forever, of a single moment after which everything was different. Real history is quieter and more sweeping. The old Western world faded across years and decades as movement became regulated, communication became immediate, space became organized and administered, and the conditions that had made improvisation possible were systematically replaced with conditions that made it unnecessary. Railroads made remote places reachable, by the standards of Eastern commerce, rather than only by the standards of frontier endurance. Telegraph lines allowed distant authorities to respond to developments at a speed that made the old advantages of geographic isolation increasingly difficult to exploit. Census counts, land surveys, territorial courts, and the expanding reach of state and federal power made the old informal arrangements harder to sustain against people with legal documents and institutional backing. Even towns that still looked rough on their surfaces were becoming tied into national systems of commerce, law, and information in ways that constrained the freedom of action that frontier conditions had previously allowed. The frontier did not disappear because adventure ran out, or because everyone suddenly became civilized. It disappeared because the nation learned how to measure, connect, claim, and monitor a landscape that had once seemed too vast to fully control. That is the reality behind the legend. An era famous for freedom and danger ended not through violence, but through infrastructure. It was administered out of existence by processes that were largely invisible from the inside until the transformation was already nearly complete. Riders, railroads, and the stitching of a continent. The Pony Express lasted barely 18 months from its first ride to its last. Yet it became one of the most enduring symbols the American West ever produced. Its legend feels far larger than its actual lifespan, because the image it offered was exactly the kind of image people wanted the West to embody. A lone rider, racing through vast and dangerous country, changing horses at speed, carrying urgent communications across distances that would have taken weeks by any other method. Speed, courage, and the drama of individual effort against enormous odds compressed into one clean and repeatable symbol. The service operated from April 1860 until October 1861, when the completion of a transcontinental telegraph line made it commercially obsolete overnight. The technology that replaced it was invisible and infinitely faster, and the contrast between the Pony Express rider and the telegraph wire became itself a symbol of the frontier giving way to modernity, of romance yielding to efficiency, of a certain kind of Western life being overtaken by the future it had helped build. The system that made the service work was more complex and more carefully engineered than the romantic image suggests. Relay stations were placed at intervals of roughly 10 to 15 miles across the entire route from Missouri to California, close enough together that a horse could be ridden hard to each one without breaking down, far enough apart that the number of stations required remained manageable. At each station, a fresh horse waited, already saddled and ready. The rider's job was to arrive, transfer the mochila, the specially designed leather carrier that held the mail, to the new mount, and continue with barely a pause. Every exchange was a small act of practiced precision under time pressure. The mochila had to move quickly. The new horse had to stand still enough to mount without difficulty. The rider had to be able to remount at speed after a hard ride without the luxury of a recovery period. Station workers had to have the fresh horse ready at the right moment, because the system had no tolerance for delays that accumulated across hundreds of stations spread over 2,000 miles. The speed came from this living relay network, not from any individual rider's exceptional endurance, but from the coordination of many people across a chain of isolated points. It was a network disguised as a dare, and every successful handoff through difficult country and bad weather, with the constant possibility of failure, pushed the message one step further toward its destination. The railroad that eventually replaced the Pony Express did something far more comprehensive and far more permanent to the relationship between distance and daily life in the American West. Before the rails, distance was the fundamental fact of Western existence, the condition from which everything else derived and against which every plan had to be measured. It shaped the price of food in ways that could make basic sustenance expensive beyond ordinary wages. It shaped the pace at which news moved in ways that meant events in distant places might be weeks old before they became known in remote settlements. It shaped the reach of law in ways that gave geographic isolation a practical value for people who preferred to operate outside legal oversight. It shaped the odds of survival in ways that made the difference between being near a supply line and being far from one a matter of genuine consequence. The railroad shattered that old logic with a completeness that transformed the imaginative as well as the practical landscape of the West. A town that had existed in genuine isolation, where every supply had to be transported at significant cost, and every connection to the wider world maintained at significant effort, could suddenly plug into national markets and national politics almost overnight once tracks arrived. The cost of goods dropped, the speed of communication increased, the range of things that could practically be attempted in remote locations expanded dramatically. People and ideas moved with a reliability that older transport methods had never consistently provided. But the railroad stitched the continent together and split communities apart in the same motion. And that double effect is one of the most important truths about Western railroad history. A line of tracks might bring wealth, population growth, and connection to one settlement while bypassing another only a few miles away and leaving it to decline without the commerce the railroad carried. Within towns, the tracks themselves created physical boundaries, areas defined as being on one side of the railroad or the other, with everything that implied for property values, neighborhood character, and the daily logistics of people whose work or homes lay on one side and whose destinations lay on the other. The railroad also cut through lands already occupied and already organized according to older patterns of use and movement. Migration routes that had been followed for generations were interrupted. Grazing patterns were disrupted. The noise and physical presence of trains in country that had previously known neither introduced changes whose full consequences took years to become visible. For native nations whose territories the tracks crossed, the railroad was not only a transportation technology, it was infrastructure that would make the consolidation of external control over their lands far easier and far faster than it would otherwise have been. Chinese laborers built much of the most difficult railroad work in the West under conditions and with treatment that represent one of the clearest examples of the era's willingness to exploit people it simultaneously depended on. Thousands of Chinese workers took on the most dangerous and physically demanding railroad construction tasks available, blasting through granite mountains, working on steep slopes in conditions that killed without drama, enduring punishing weather in remote camps that offered minimal shelter and minimal comfort. Their discipline, endurance, and technical competence were widely acknowledged by employers when acknowledging It served the employers' interests. Their essential contribution to building the infrastructure that the West depended on was visible to anyone who chose to look honestly at what they had accomplished. Yet the same society that benefited from their labor treated them with routine hostility, legal exclusion, economic exploitation, and periodic violence. They were paid less than white workers for equivalent and often more dangerous work. They were legally barred from citizenship. They were subjected to discriminatory taxes and regulations that targeted them specifically. They were the targets of mob violence in multiple Western cities at different points during the era, with loss of life and property that went largely unpunished because the victims were Chinese. This contradiction, essential to the project, treated as unwanted in its results, sits at the heart of Western railroad history and refuses to be explained away or excused by the standards of the time. The Cattle Kingdom. The cattle drive north from Texas to the Kansas railheads was one of the most astonishing regular logistical operations the American West ever produced, and one of the most routinely dangerous. The drive required moving thousands of animals over hundreds of miles through country that offered uncertain water, unpredictable weather, and terrain that tested both livestock and handlers constantly. Unlike manufactured goods in crates or mail in a leather pouch, cattle were living wealth, responsive to fear, vulnerable to disease, capable of collective panic, and absolutely dependent on finding adequate grass and water along a route that might not always have both available at the right moments. The herd was simultaneously the fortune being transported and the primary source of risk to the enterprise. A single bad night, a single panicked run across rocky ground in darkness, a single river crossing that went wrong. Any of these could destroy months of careful management and eliminate the profit the entire journey was meant to produce. The men on the trail were not transporting objects. They were escorting a breathing investment that could become worthless with terrifying speed. Longhorn cattle made the whole enterprise possible through qualities that had been shaped by generations of life in conditions that would have defeated less resilient animals. Texas Longhorns had developed over decades in an environment that provided minimal human care and maximum natural challenge. They were lean, tough, resistant to many of the diseases that devastated more carefully bred cattle, and capable of covering the distances the drives required while subsisting on forage that would not sustain less hardy breeds. Their spread of horns, which could reach 6 feet or more from tip to tip in exceptional animals, made them visually striking and occasionally dangerous to handle at close quarters. But their real value to the cattle industry was the endurance that allowed them to walk from Texas to Kansas and arrive at the other end in condition fit for sale. Without that endurance, the economics of the cattle drive would not have worked. The animals had to be able to survive the journey. The fact that they routinely could is what made the trail drives commercially viable and what turned the Texas cattle industry from a regional curiosity into a national economic force. The trail boss carried responsibility for the enterprise that extended in every direction. He had to read weather from signs that experienced plainsmen understood and newcomers missed. The color of the horizon at specific times of day, the behavior of animals, the direction and smell of the wind. He had to judge routes through country he might be crossing for the first time, making decisions about water sources and river crossings based on information that was incomplete and sometimes wrong. He had to manage supplies across weeks of travel, rationing what was available against the uncertain timeline of a journey
that weather and terrain could extend beyond any original estimate. He also had to manage people, which was often harder than managing cattle. Weeks on the trail produced a specific kind of social pressure that required active management to keep from becoming destructive. Men grew tired in ways that eroded patience and shortened tempers. Minor frictions that would barely register in ordinary life could become genuine conflicts after weeks of sleeping rough and eating limited food in demanding physical conditions. A boss who understood human psychology as well as cattle management could absorb those pressures and redirect them into useful work.
A boss who could not found himself managing a crew that was working against him at the moments when he needed their full cooperation most. Stampedes were the trail drive's most dramatic form of failure, and the terror they generated was proportional to their genuine destructiveness. A herd that was settled and moving predictably in daylight could become an avalanche of terrified muscle within seconds, given the right combination of darkness, unexpected sound, and animal fear. The mechanism of a stampede was simple and almost impossible to interrupt once it began. Fear in one animal communicated instantly to its neighbors, which communicated to their neighbors, and within moments, the entire mass of animals was moving with a force and momentum that no human intervention could stop, only redirect, and eventually exhaust. Cattle ran in darkness over country they could not see clearly, and riders trying to turn a stampede ran with them through the same blindness. Men were thrown when horses stumbled. Men were trampled when they fell in the path of the herd. Animals ran into ravines or into water, or simply ran until they dropped from exhaustion miles from where the panic had started. The work of recovering scattered cattle after a major stampede could take days and might never recover the full herd. River crossings concentrated a different category of danger into a compressed space and time. A river that looked manageable from the bank could change character entirely once the herd entered it. Currents stronger than they appeared could pull animals sideways. Muddy bottoms could give way under the weight of thousands of animals crossing in succession. Banks that seemed adequate for entry or exit could become traps once the first animals had churned them into impassable mud. The behavior of the herd itself added unpredictability. Animals panicking in midstream, turning back against the flow, bunching in ways that created dangerous crowding, responding to the distress of animals around them in ways that amplified rather than resolved the problem. A successful river crossing, accomplished with the herd intact and the crew uninjured, was a real achievement that everyone involved understood as such. A crossing that went badly could end the journey, injure or kill riders, and eliminate the entire financial purpose of the drive in one catastrophic afternoon. The longhorn cattle that made all of this possible were eventually replaced by other breeds as the economics of the industry shifted. Eastern markets developed preferences for beef with different characteristics the longhorns provided. Ranching became more intensive and less nomadic, as barbed wire enclosed ranges and railroads reached closer to production areas. The great trail drives that had defined the cattle kingdom for a generation became economically unnecessary and then disappeared within a relatively short period. What remained was the legend, the image of the drives and the riders and the open range that they had briefly made available and then permanently closed. Native nations, resistance, and broken promises. The standard version of Western history, as it was taught for much of the 20th century, treated native resistance to expansion as a series of episodes: famous battles, famous leaders, famous negotiations that punctuated an otherwise inevitable process. The resistance happened. It failed. The story moved on. That framework misrepresents the nature of what actually occurred in ways that matter enormously for understanding the era honestly. Native nations across the West did not simply react to expansion and then accept its consequences. They resisted, adapted, negotiated, fought, withdrew strategically, sought alliances, and continued contesting the terms of their situation across decades through every means available to them. The struggle was not a series of episodes. It was continuous, shifting in form as conditions changed, and shaped by the specific circumstances and strategies of specific peoples in specific places, rather than by any single pattern that applied everywhere. What drove the resistance was not simply opposition to newcomers or resistance to change. It was the defense of specific things that specific peoples depended on for their continued existence. Hunting grounds that provided food, water sources that supported communities, migration routes that seasonal life required, treaty rights that had been formally recognized and then systematically violated, and the broader capacity to maintain ways of life that gave their communities coherence and meaning across generations. The Plains Wars that dominated the central decades of the era were not military conflicts in the conventional sense of two organized forces contesting territorial control. They were expressions of a fundamental incompatibility between expansion's requirements and the requirements of the peoples whose lands expansion was consuming, conducted under conditions where one side's power was growing and the other's was being systematically reduced. The Comanche had dominated the southern plains for generations before American expansion reached them in force. And understanding their history requires taking seriously the scale of the power they had built. At the height of their influence, the Comanche controlled an enormous territory across the southern plains and surrounding regions. They had developed a culture built around the horse, obtained originally from Spanish colonial sources, and then bred and managed with extraordinary skill that gave them military capabilities, hunting efficiency, and geographic reach that made them formidable against virtually every adversary they encountered. Their raiding capabilities extended hundreds of miles in multiple directions. Their trade networks connected them to peoples and markets across a wide region. Their military power was sufficient to check Spanish expansion for decades, and to complicate American expansion significantly during the early period of contact. To understand the West honestly means understanding that Comanche power was a genuine force that shaped the region's history for a significant period, not merely a problem to be solved by expansion, but an independent power that expansion had to reckon with, and eventually, through sustained military pressure and the destruction of the bison herds, defeat. The destruction of the bison herds was not only a commercial development with incidental consequences for native peoples. It was a civilizational blow that struck at the material foundation of Plains life with a completeness that no military campaign could have matched. Bison provided food, not as a supplement to other sources, but as the primary nutritional foundation for peoples whose entire way of life was built around the herd's seasonal movements. They provided materials for clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods.
Their hides covered the teepees that housed communities through Plains winters. Their bones became tools. Their sinew became bowstring. Their dung became fuel in a landscape with little wood. The relationship between Plains peoples and bison was not simply economic. It was cultural, spiritual, and existential in the most direct sense. When hunters working for the hide trade, facilitated by railroads that made transportation of hides efficient and profitable, destroyed their herds with a speed that left almost no time for adaptation, the consequences for Plains peoples were not a loss of one resource among many.
They were the destruction of the material basis of life itself, followed by forced dependence on government ration systems that were unreliable, inadequate, and controlled by people who understood dependence as a tool of control rather than a responsibility to be honored. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 shocked the United States, not simply because soldiers died, but because it disrupted a narrative. The United States had been constructing a story about Western expansion, in which native resistance was an obstacle being systematically overcome. Brave, perhaps, but ultimately futile against the larger forces of civilization and progress. The defeat of a significant American cavalry force under a commander who was already famous at the hands of native fighters who had come together specifically to defend against encroachment made that narrative suddenly and embarrassingly unconvincing. The response was not accommodation or reconsideration. It was intensification. The shock produced demands for punishment and expanded military campaigns that increased pressure on native nations across the region significantly in the years that followed. The victory at Little Bighorn, genuine and significant as it was, helped generate the conditions that made subsequent resistance increasingly difficult to sustain. Reservations were the institutional form through which the long-term management of native peoples was organized after the military phase of expansion was largely complete, and they were never the benevolent solution that official language often presented them as. They were spaces of enforced compression. Peoples whose lives had been organized around movement, seasonal migration following game, flexible responses to weather and resource availability, trade networks that extended across large territories, were confined to fixed areas chosen for administrative convenience rather than for their capacity to support the life being forced into them. Food systems that had sustained communities for generations were disrupted or destroyed. Sacred landscapes were cut off. The ability to move, to maintain traditional practices, and to make decisions according to internal authority rather than external oversight was systematically constrained. The ghost dance movement that spread across the plains in the late 1880s and early 1890s emerged from this landscape of loss, and its emotional power came directly from the depth of that loss. It offered renewal in conditions that seemed to deny renewal was possible. It spread because people needed something more than the material inadequacy of reservation life could offer. Needed meaning, connection, hope, and the sense that their situation was not permanently and irreversibly fixed. That external authorities responded to this spiritual movement with fear, misunderstanding, and eventually violence says more about those authorities than about the movement itself. Women outlaws and the making of myth, the West, that appeared in popular stories, dime novels, theatrical performances, and eventually early films, was a West that had been edited with a specific purpose in mind. The editing removed complexity, reduced the cast, whitened the participants, simplified the motivations, and accelerated the action. What remained was vivid, portable, and emotionally satisfying in ways that the more complicated original had never managed to be. Women managed businesses, ran communities, and sustained the practical life of frontier settlements in ways that the edited version consistently failed to represent. The boarding house owner who kept travelers fed and rested, who maintained the accounts, managed the staff, negotiated with suppliers, and kept the establishment functioning through conditions that would have defeated many of her male contemporaries. She rarely appeared in the stories that defined the era. The ranch wife who handled the books, made decisions during a husband's absence, maintained relationships with neighbors and suppliers, and kept an operation going through seasons of drought and market collapse, was peripheral to narratives that preferred gunfighters and outlaws. Yet these women were not peripheral to the actual life of the frontier. They were central to it in the most direct and practical sense. Frontier communities needed competent people in large numbers, and women were those people, constantly, doing work that was essential to the survival of settlements that could not afford to run on mythology alone. Annie Oakley represented something more dramatic, but equally significant. The possibility that a woman could achieve mastery in a domain that the culture associated exclusively with men, and could do so publicly before enormous audiences, in ways that demanded acknowledgement rather than simply acceptance. She took marksmanship, a practical frontier skill, and transformed it through discipline, presentation, and genuine excellence into spectacle of the highest order. Before crowds of thousands, she shattered targets with a calm precision that seemed almost unreal. She did this with a composure that made the difficulty invisible, which was itself a form of artistry. Her fame came not only from accuracy, but from the particular quality of authority she projected, the quality of someone who was entirely in command of a dangerous skill and entirely comfortable with that command being seen. Her success challenged the cultural association between firearms and masculine identity without making that challenge explicit or confrontational. She simply demonstrated, repeatedly and in public, that the association was not accurate. That demonstration was more effective than any argument could have been. Jesse James understood something about the relationship between violence and narrative that most of his contemporaries did not. And that understanding was central to his becoming the legend he became. His robberies were real. The violence his gang committed was real. The fear he generated in the people he targeted was real. But the Jesse James that became a national figure was not primarily the product of the robberies themselves. It was the product of how those robberies were covered, contextualized, and transformed by newspapers that found in his career exactly the kind of material their readers wanted. Moral complexity dressed in frontier drama. Some editors condemned him straightforwardly. Others found ways to link him to the grievances of ex-Confederates, to resentment of banks and railroads, to the romance of the outlaw who defied institutional power on behalf of ordinary people. Whether those linkages were accurate was largely beside the point. They were emotionally resonant, and emotional resonance was what drove newspaper sales in an era when competition between publications was fierce and dramatic material was a commercial advantage. James understood publicity. He was not merely a subject of press coverage. He was, in some meaningful sense, a participant in his own mythologization. someone who understood that his reputation had value and that managing it was part of the work of being what he was. Billy the Kid's story endures with particular force because of the way it combines youth, violence, and early death into a combination that mythology finds almost irresistible. The actual person involved, a young man who participated in the violence of the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, killed people, evaded capture with some skill and some luck, and died at 21 at the hands of a sheriff who had known him personally. The historical record is real and worth knowing, but what has given the kid his lasting presence in American imagination is not primarily the historical record. It is the pattern of youth and danger and early ending that the record contains. An early death freezes a figure in a powerful way that a long life never can. There is no decline, no long retreat into ordinary middle age, no slow fading into the kind of obscurity that overtakes most people eventually. The figure remains permanently young, permanently at the moment of maximum intensity, permanently available for interpretation and reinvention by later generations, who find in the image whatever they need it to contain. The shootout at the OK Corral lasted approximately 30 seconds, from first shot to last. That brevity is one of the most important and least acknowledged facts about the most famous gunfight in Western history. 30 seconds of violence. Chaotic, close range, poorly aimed in many cases, over before the sound had fully stopped echoing off the surrounding buildings, became the central event around which an enormous mythology was constructed over the following century. The construction was not accidental. It was built from testimony, journalism, subsequent legal proceedings, memoirs written decades later, theatrical performances, novels, and eventually films, that each added elements, softened others, and gradually shaped the 30 seconds into something that felt like a definitive confrontation between order and chaos, civilization and savagery, good and evil. The actual confrontation was rooted in local politics, personal animosity, competing economic interests, and the specific tensions of a mining boom town in the early 1880s. It was messier, more ambiguous, and considerably less satisfying as a moral narrative than the version that survived it. Testimony about who fired first, and whether certain participants were given fair warning, contradicted other testimony. The legal proceedings that followed were inconclusive. The moral clarity that later versions imposed was not present in the event itself. What survived and grew was not the event, but the idea of the event. The image of two sides facing each other in a moment of final reckoning, with the West itself somehow at stake in the outcome. That image proved more durable than any fact. What the West actually built. The history of the American West is usually remembered through its most dramatic elements: the gunfights and gold rushes, the outlaws and lawmen, the famous names and famous confrontations that have been retold so many times they feel more like myth than history. That retelling has been so thorough and so persistent that recovering the less dramatic truth requires some effort. The less dramatic truth is that the West was built primarily through ordinary labor, applied under difficult conditions by people whose names were not famous and whose stories were not particularly vivid by the standards of dime novel entertainment. Surveyors walked across country that had never been formally mapped, measuring and recording the land that would subsequently be bought, sold, claimed, and contested by people who would never know or acknowledge their work. Clerks in territorial offices processed the paperwork that converted landscapes into property and claims into legal rights. Lawyers navigated the collision between different legal traditions, American, Mexican, and various forms of indigenous law that the shifting of borders had created without resolving. Teachers operated in rooms that were still half-built, with materials that were inadequate, in communities that needed what they provided, but could not always afford to pay for it. Mexican communities had been central to Western life long before the borders shifted over them, and their centrality did not disappear when sovereignty changed hands. Town life, cattle work, land use, architectural traditions, food practices, and local governance across the entire Southwest carried deep Mexican roots that predated American arrival by generations. When the Mexican-American War transferred sovereignty over the region, daily life did not reset. People who had been living in their own communities, under their own laws and their own customs, suddenly found themselves in a different legal and political environment, one that was often hostile to their existing claims, and that provided mechanisms through which those claims could be challenged, delayed, and ultimately defeated. Land grants that had been recognized under Mexican law entered a new legal environment in which their validity was subject to challenge, their documentation subject to interpretation, and their defense subject to costs that could exhaust a family's resources without producing a final resolution. The collision between legal systems was not accidental. It was a mechanism through which property accumulated over generations could be transferred to new owners through legal process rather than through direct seizure, which was more respectable in appearance while being equivalent in result. The building of civic institutions, the schools and hospitals and newspapers and churches and courts that turned collections of people into communities, was work that required sustained effort and genuine investment without the dramatic payoff that mining or cattle or land speculation could theoretically provide. A school required someone willing to teach for wages that rarely matched the work involved, in conditions that were rarely adequate for the purpose, for students whose attendance was irregular because family labor demands competed with educational ones. It required a community willing to allocate resources to a purpose whose benefits were long-term and diffuse rather than immediate and individual. It required persistence through the setbacks that were inevitable in environments where buildings burned, populations shifted, and the economic basis of the community could change without warning. The newspaper was in some ways the most revealing institution of frontier town building because it was the institution that made the community's claim to itself most explicitly. A newspaper published in a new settlement was a declaration, a statement that this place had things worth saying, people worth informing, events worth recording, opinions worth expressing. Before the streets were paved, or the drainage was adequate, or the water supply was reliable, a newspaper that covered local affairs with confidence was asserting that the settlement was already real in the ways that mattered most. The claim was often premature. The assertion was always intentional. The West was also shaped by its failures in ways that the success stories obscure. For every town that grew into a city, there were many that peaked and declined and eventually disappeared. For every homesteader who succeeded in building a viable farm on the plains, there were others who failed and left. Sometimes quietly, sometimes in the kind of visible desperation that left physical evidence still visible in abandoned buildings and overgrown fields and cemetery markers, in places where no community exists today to tend them. The failures mattered as much as the successes, not because failure is more interesting than success, but because it provides a more accurate picture of what the West actually was. Not a place of reliable opportunity that rewarded effort with commensurate results, but a place of enormous variance, where the gap between the best outcomes and the worst was vast, and where the difference between the two was often more a matter of circumstance than of character. The frontier was shaped by expansion, but remembered through exaggeration. Real forces built it: migration and war, and extraction and labor, and technology and survival under difficult conditions. These were what the frontier was actually made of. Yet when the time came to remember it, exaggeration rushed in and rearranged the proportions. Gunmen grew larger, timelines shortened, complexity faded. Whole communities that had been essential to the life of the frontier slipped into the background, while a few dramatic figures strode into the light. Violence became cleaner and more purposeful than it was. Progress seemed simpler and more inevitable than it was. Conquest sounded more noble and less costly than it was. The people who paid the highest prices were pushed to the edges of a story that was increasingly organized around the experiences and perspectives of those who had paid the lowest ones. That editing process did not produce simple falsehood. The events it described were real. The people it centered did exist, and did the things attributed to them. What it produced was distortion through selection. A version of history organized around the most dramatically satisfying elements, at the expense of the most honestly representative ones. The gap between the real West and the remembered West is not a flaw in the story. It is part of the story. To engage seriously with the frontier is to watch a real place being transformed twice. First by expansion itself, and then by the myths that claimed it afterward and converted its complicated reality into something cleaner and more portable, and far easier to sell. And so the West begins to soften again, not as a place of sharp edges and sudden danger, but as a memory stretching across quiet plains and fading trails. We have wandered through towns that rose in a rush and vanished just as quickly. We have followed railroads that stitched distance together and fences that quietly closed the open land. We have met riders and workers and dreamers and outlaws, each carrying their own story into a world that never stood still for long. We have seen how hope could build a life in a single season, and how loss could unmake it just as swiftly. We have seen how myth rushed in to replace what reality left behind, sharpening the colors, simplifying the shapes, and forgetting the many faces that didn't fit the frame. The real West was messier than the legend, more crowded with different kinds of people, more shaped by paperwork and ordinary endurance than by pistols and dramatic moments, more consequential for far more people than the story that survived it ever fully acknowledged. And perhaps that is exactly why it remains worth returning to. not the myth, but what lives beneath it. Wherever you are listening from tonight, let your breathing settle into something slow and steady. Let the room be quiet. Let the wide horizon that once promised everything feel still and calm and far away. There is nothing left to chase, nowhere you need to go. The West can wait. The stories can rest. Sleep well and good night.